When explorers couldn't agree on where Florida's coastline actually was, the result wasn't just confusion, it was catastrophe dressed up as confidence. Welcome to Chapter 2 of The Rise the Limit, Shadow Charts and Florida Fantasies, where a pilot named Diego Miruelo traded glass beads for salvaged gold along a Gulf Coast he couldn't accurately locate, and somehow his vague, unreproducible memory of that trip helped steer a full-scale expedition straight into disaster a decade later. It turns out that in the early 16th century, the line between a bold geographic claim and an educated guess was mostly wishful thinking, and Florida had a way of collecting the consequences. Watching the Gulf absorb a sudden outfall of dark lake water, it is easy to picture the early Panhandle shoreline as a raw, untouched frontier. The reality was far more crowded. Entering the historical timeline just as the great Mississippian cultures were peacefully reorganizing themselves feels like arriving at a party as the hosts begin to clear the tables. Across the Atlantic, an entirely different kind of restructuring was underway, driven by a uniquely Spanish blend of ambition and paperwork. Their version of corporate shuffling involved less cooperation and more litigation, as if a homeowners association had been given two continents to argue over. It is here, in the margins of this grand, belligerent enterprise, that we find a man named Diego Miruelo, a figure so shadowy he seems less like a historical person and more like a rumor with a boat. History has mostly misplaced Miruelo, filing him somewhere under miscellaneous seaman with questionable motives. We know he was sailing the Caribbean by 1513, 2 decades after Columbus triggered a chaotic hemispheric land grab. Before he became a footnote in the doomed Ailon colony near Savannah, or a possible associate of Ponce de Leon in the Turks and Caicos, Miruelo was a working man of the sea. His job title was pilot, which in the early 1500s meant he theoretically possessed the highly coveted skill of not immediately wrecking a ship upon leaving port. He could read currents and coastlines with a spatial geometry that passed for technical magic at the time. He was, however, almost certainly applying this navigational calculus to the underground economy of the Antilles. To be blunt, Miruelo was a poacher of human beings, operating out of Cuba and sneaking into territories where he had no legal right to be. The reasons a skilled pilot might go rogue are buried in the spectacularly venomous political atmosphere of the era. Spanish leadership was consumed by a massive feud between Juan Ponce de Leon and Diego Colón, the son of Christopher Columbus. Colón, acting as the viceroy of Hispaniola, spent years in court arguing that his father's contract with the monarchs amounted to a divine right to rule every rock and sandbar yet discovered. The king, wary of the Columbus family's growing power, saw Ponce de Leon as a useful loyalist. He authorized Ponce to conquer Puerto Rico, deliberately bypassing Colón's authority. This did not sit well. By 1511, Colón had politically neutered Ponce, forcing him from office. Humiliated, Ponce returned to Spain. The king needed to keep his man occupied and offered him a consolation prize, a license to explore and settle Bimini and any lands to the north, which were theoretically outside Colón's jurisdiction. This royal permission slip led directly to Ponce's 1513 voyage and the formal discovery of La Florida. Navigating these waters required a high tolerance for probabilistic error. A sailor could fix his latitude, his north-south position, by observing the stars. Longitude, his east-west position, was a complete mystery. It was a blank space on the map, solved only by a form of institutionalized guesswork called dead reckoning. Miruelo, a man of practical rather than academic skill, probably navigated by memory and instinct, a method akin to finding a parked car in a vast lot with your eyes closed. While Ponce de Leon gets official credit for Florida, a strong historical theory assigns high confidence to the idea that Miruelo was already lurking there, having perhaps been blown off course on an earlier slaving run. In 1513, his presence was no accident. It is strongly suspected that Diego Colon, furious at Ponce's new charter, hired Miruelo to spy on his rival's expedition. Miruelo's vessel, a small bark from Hispaniola, shadowed Ponce's larger flotilla, the 16th-century equivalent of a rusty scooter tailing a motorcade. His job was plausibly to report Ponce's findings back to Colon, or maybe even to poach the discovery for himself. No one knows which, because the universe, acting as the supreme controller of calamity, had other plans. Sometime in mid-1513, near the Bahamas, a storm descended. Ponce's sturdier, deep-draft ships weathered the wind. Miruelo's little bark was not so fortunate. His anchor dragged. The ship was battered to pieces in the shallows. In a sublime twist of maritime logistics, the man sent to spy on Ponce de Leon had to be rescued by him. A waterlogged Miruelo and his crew were pulled from the churning sea and brought aboard his rival's ship. The spy lost his vessel, but he survived. Saved by his target, he was left as a broken man to sail toward his own grim destiny in the very land he may have been the first to see. Lost shores. Miruelo's misleading maps. 3 years after being humiliatingly fished out of the Bahamian surf by his own target, Diego Miruelo remained famously immune to basic professional advice. A pilot was supposed to be a meticulous record keeper, warned that neglecting to track a ship's course was a great navigational error. Having lost his vessel in the service of Diego Colon's corporate espionage, a lesser man might have retired to pursue competitive lawsuit filing, the actual preferred sport of Spanish colonists. But the ghost pilot had not given up. In 1516, he surfaced in Cuba and secured a single ship for what provincial officials delicately called a trading cruise. This venture was exactly as benevolent as a wolf conducting an agricultural survey of a henhouse. His true mission was to head north again toward the Florida coast to acquire resources, meaning human bodies. Upon making landfall somewhere along that vast coastline, Miruelo did manage to pull off a highly successful business transaction. He and his men traded European manufactured goods, mostly glass beads and brutally efficient iron tools, to the local indigenous people. In return, the coastal residents gave him gold. It was not a mountain of wealth, but it was enough to make a desperate pilot's eyes widen. He had confirmed the most potent rumor of the era. Raw riches were simply sitting on the shoreline for the taking. The profound irony, which Miruelo entirely missed, was that the gold had not been mined from the local earth. Enterprising coastal communities had almost certainly salvaged it from the wrecks of other, less fortunate Spanish ships already smashed to pieces against the offshore sandbars. Miruelo had stumbled into a thriving secondary salvage economy, proving that capitalizing on the navigational failures of others was a booming business long before the invention of modern tow fleets. Despite the shiny metals, historians agree this contact was less about commerce and more about scouting the beaches for future slaving raids. Miruelo sailed back to Cuba a success, at least for a man who measured his career in portable, shiny objects. He claimed to have found a massive estuary, which he immodestly named Miruelo Bay. He had a compelling story, a small pile of gold, and proof of a coastline ripe for exploitation. He possessed everything a captain could possibly need except for the single piece of information that mattered, because he had failed to record his precise latitude. In an act of professional malpractice bordering on the poetic, the man could not draw a reliable map to his own discovery. Historians now suspect his bay was Pensacola, which means Miruelo was likely the first European to sail directly past the future resort footprint of 30A. Others argue the coordinates point to Appalachia or Tampa Bay. We do not know for sure because the truth dissolved into the incoherent lament of a water-stained logbook. His glorious, unrepeatable secret evaporated almost immediately. While Miruelo had given the Spanish crown a rumor attached to a shoreline, true professionals were arriving to clean up the margins. In 1519, Alonso Alvarez de Pineda sailed from Jamaica with a proper fleet and a clear mandate to systematically chart the entire Gulf Coast. Where Miruelo supplied a lucky data point, Pineda provided a reproducible map, cementing his place in history while consigning the ghost pilot to the footnotes. Pineda produced the Gulf's first real chart. Miruelo had only perfected the cartography of ambiguity. Yet this single, poorly documented voyage remained historically lethal. Miruelo's vague tales of a massive bay and easy gold directly informed the flawed premise of the disastrous 1528 Panfilo de Narvaez expedition into Florida. Men eventually marched themselves to death trying to find Miruelo Bay with all the confidence of explorers following directions sketched on a cocktail napkin. Chasing coordinates that never existed poked fatal holes in their survival plans. But well before Narvaez vanished into the Panhandle swamps looking for that phantom bay, he was busy being humiliated in an entirely different theater of the Spanish corporate wars. Cortés's gambit, crown, gold, and unwitting kings. Long before Panfilo de Narvaez dragged his doomed men through the Panhandle swamps, he was missing in action during a critical chapter of those very same Spanish corporate wars. While pilots like Diego Miruelo were making names for themselves by getting spectacularly confused off the Florida coast, a far more calculated drama of ambition and betrayal was brewing back in Cuba. Sponsoring an ambitious subordinate with a history of mutiny might sound like an obvious tactical error today, but colonial governance operated on an entirely different spectrum of human foolishness. At the center of this impending disaster were the island's powerful governor Diego Velázquez and his dangerously independent secretary Hernán Cortés. Around 1512, Cortés was a man on the rise. As one of the original conquerors of Cuba, he had earned the attention of Governor Velázquez, who saw in him a literate and vivacious aide, a man who could pepper his speech with Latin, which, in the 16th-century colonial world, was the equivalent of having a really good LinkedIn profile. Velázquez made Cortés his personal secretary and confidant, trusting him with the delicate machinery of diplomacy. For a few months, it was a perfect partnership between a powerful patron and his promising protégé. Naturally, the arrangement collapsed. By 1514, Cortés began to weary of taking orders, exhibiting the first clear symptoms of the independent streak that would eventually define his historical footprint. He secretly plotted to sail back to Hispaniola, carrying a cache of letters detailing the governor's various abuses of power. It was, essentially, a disgruntled intern planning to report his regional manager directly to Imperial Human Resources. Velázquez discovered the plot before a ship could launch, seized his secretary, and nearly had him hanged in a sudden fit of rage. Cooler heads eventually prevailed. Local residents pleaded for the young man's life, and Velázquez relented, opting to strip Cortés of his administrative duties and place him on strict, indefinite probation. What followed was a meticulous masterclass in feigned repentance. For the next few years, Cortés behaved with excessive humility, projecting the aura of a thoroughly reformed civil servant. He went out of his way to please everyone he encountered, right down to the lowliest of the governor's household staff. This protracted performance reached a cynical peak when Cortés asked his former boss to serve as godfather at his wedding. By becoming compadres, the two men entered a sacred familial bond. The marriage request was a brilliant operational maneuver that cemented their reconciliation, at least on paper. Historians note that this renewed trust bloomed just as rumors from the West began to electrify the island. Expeditions returning from the Yucatan in 1517 and 1518 brought spectacular tales of a wealthy Maya civilization, physically backed by gold hauls worth tens of thousands of pesos. Velázquez was eager to claim these new lands and required a capable captain to command a third, much larger fleet. His most trusted enforcer, Pánfilo de Narváez, was inconveniently away in Spain. Lacking his primary heavy and seemingly ignoring his own lingering doubts about his secretary's actual character, Velázquez turned to his recently redeemed compadre and offered him the job. Cortés grabbed the opportunity like a possessed man. He poured his own money into the venture, bought ships, and used his formidable charisma to convince merchants to give him supplies on credit. But as the fleet grew, so did Velázquez's anxiety. He saw the same old independence flaring up in his old secretary, this time on a much grander scale. At the 11th hour, the governor had a moment of clarity and tried to revoke the command. It was too late. Cortés was, as one observer noted, too deeply involved to be stopped. In the pre-dawn gloom of November 18, 1518, he gathered his men and slipped out of the harbor, defying the governor's direct orders. When a frantic Velázquez galloped to the shore at daybreak, all he could do was shout across the water, asking his former protégé why he was leaving without a proper farewell. Cortés, already sailing toward his destiny, could barely respond. Beyond the burn, scuttled ships, golden schemes. What comes next on the agenda for an aspiring rogue conquistador? After slipping past his sputtering godfather in the pre-dawn gloom, the newly fugitive Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican mainland and promptly decided to make the break permanent. There is a famous phrase for this behavior: Cortés burned his ships. It is a line that sounds magnificent, especially if one imagines it delivered with the gravelly Scottish authority of a Russian submarine captain. The only problem is he did no such thing. The reality was less a blaze of glory and more an act of aggressive, irreversible recycling. In the summer of 1519, soon after founding a new town he brazenly named Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, Cortés ordered his small fleet scuttled. The historical record, extracted from his own carefully worded letters and the accounts of his chronicler Bernal Diaz, describes men stripping the vessels of their anchors, cables, and sails. They purposefully sank or beached the empty hulls. The dramatic bonfire plausibly came later as a useful legend borrowed from older war stories, largely because dismantling ships for parts lacks a certain cinematic flair. Archaeologists, those patient killjoys of thrilling myth, have since confirmed the dry paperwork by finding 500-year-old anchors from the fleet in the Gulf shallows. Iron survives underwater far better than ash. Destroying a fleet seems like the action of a madman. It was actually the cold calculation of a politician. The expedition was technically off the books. The governor of Cuba wanted the rogue commander brought back in chains. One man's mutiny, however, is another man's bold initiative. Sinking the ships prevented retreat. It simultaneously forced a fragile coalition of Spaniards and indigenous allies to look in exactly one direction, inland toward the Mexica capital. Cortés cemented the gamble by founding his own town council. This was a clever legal maneuver to claim he was acting directly for the King of Spain, bypassing his fuming ex-boss entirely. Go all in, accept the risk, dare the empire to stop you. Legal paperwork requires extreme leverage. Fortunately, Moctezuma's emissaries soon arrived bearing an astonishing welcome package: gold necklaces, intricate statues, and 2 discs the size of carriage wheels. One of solid gold representing the sun, the other of silver for the moon. In July 1519, Cortés packed these riches onto his last and best ship. He dispatched it directly to Spain. The vessel stopped briefly for supplies on the Cuban coast. A local resident caught a peek at the cargo and later reported with understandable shock that the ship utilized no other ballast than gold. Standing on the high quartz dunes of 30A, watching modern fishing boats disappear over the Gulf horizon, it is not difficult to imagine the moment that news finally reached Governor Velázquez. As the report of a gold-ballasted ship sank in, his fury was plausibly completely personal. I can almost hear him obsessing over the agonizing details. He had, after all, served as godfather at the wedding and likely purchased an expensive gift. The act of clemency he had shown his secretary years earlier had eroded into the most devastating swindle of his life. Velázquez immediately sent 2 ships to chase down the treasure. Cortés was already a ghost. The disgraced governor would spend his final years assembling a massive armada to arrest the man who had cheated him, a man whose particularly intimate brand of treachery could only be described as a godfather's leech. Yet Velázquez was not the only rival suddenly fixated on the western horizon. This unchecked corporate theft sent shockwaves through the Caribbean, triggering a desperate cartographic race. If one rogue operative could bypass the chain of command and locate a golden empire, the remaining colonial governors needed to chart the blank coastal waters to the north before Cortés claimed those territories too. Mapping marvels, misfortune's mark on Amichel. The sudden realization of this unchecked conquest triggered an immediate race. It might seem improbable that there was room for another ambitious Spaniard to sail into the Gulf and start planting flags while Hernán Cortés was actively dismantling an empire. The reality is the water was thoroughly crowded, though the endeavor ended violently for the newcomers. While Governor Velázquez fumed in Cuba over his stolen ships, Governor Francisco de Garay of Jamaica bankrolled his own massive exploration enterprise. He was convinced he could outmaneuver them all. To lead this quest, he chose a cartographer named Alonso Álvarez de Pineda. Pineda's primary qualification appears to have been his skill with a compass and a heroic willingness to sail toward a coast already contested by the most formidable personality in the New World. Pineda departed Jamaica in March 1519 with 4 ships and 270 men on a mission defined by executive overconfidence. His to-do list from Garay was brief but absurd. First, he was ordered to locate the Strait of Anian. This was a mythical sea passage supposedly connecting the Gulf to the Pacific. Geographers insisted this handy shortcut to Asia must exist, largely because it balanced their maps, physical logic be damned. Second, he was told to map the entire shoreline from Florida to Mexico, filling the massive void between Juan Ponce de Leon's vague sightings and the mainland Cortés was actively fighting to control. Finally, he was expected to formally claim this enormous span of coastal real estate for Governor Garay. It was an act roughly equivalent to putting a lien on a volcano during an active eruption. For 9 months, Pineda executed his job with an almost heroic lack of drama. He traced over 800 miles of shoreline. This expedition was the first official venture to lay European eyes on the coasts of western Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, a sprawling territory he grandly named Amichel. With each consecutive degree of latitude, Pineda delivered 2 specific pieces of geographical news. His survey provided a high degree of confidence that Florida was a peninsula rather than an island, bringing relief to map enthusiasts everywhere. He also offered the earliest empirical evidence that the Gulf of Mexico was a giant watery cul-de-sac. There was no magical back door to China. The great realization of his voyage was that he had plausibly found the world's largest dead end. The first faint ink line representing the beaches of Scenic Highway 30A appeared on a European map simply because Pineda sailed right past them. He documented a coastline that would one day be prized for its sugar-white sand, but was, at the time, merely another league of inscrutable shoreline. On June 2, 1519, he noted the mouth of a massive river he named the Rio del Espiritu Santo, sailing some 18 miles upstream past 40 Native American villages. Many historically assumed this was the Mississippi. Certain killjoy historians, however, contend he was probably just in Mobile Bay, mistaking a regional outlet for a continental artery. Along this journey, Pineda functioned as a cartographer, a navigator, a military captain, an amateur diplomat, a territorial claims adjuster, and most unforgivably, someone late to the party. He became the first European explorer of Texas, dipping into what is now Corpus Christi Bay and charting a river he dubbed the Rio de las Palmas, likely the Rio Grande. His resulting map survives today at the Archivo General de Indias in Seville. It is the first map of the Gulf Coast and the first recorded piece of paper in Texas history. It was also quite crude. While it became the essential guide for subsequent colonization attempts, its utter lack of precision contributed directly to the navigational disaster that befell the Pánfilo de Narváez expedition 10 years later. It was the 16th-century equivalent of a GPS that confidently guides you into a lake. In August 1519, Pineda finished mapping his way west and sailed his fleet directly into Veracruz. He inadvertently arrived at the exact base camp for Cortés's entire operation. He sent messengers ashore with Garay's instructions to establish a boundary and dictate terms to the rogue commander. This was a catastrophic misreading of the room. Cortés had recently committed mutiny and founded a local council to launder his own terrestrial authority. He was not about to entertain a maritime rival. He promptly ordered Pineda's men captured. Watching from his ship and realizing he was horribly outmatched, Pineda cut his losses. He fled north. He sailed for 40 days, eventually landing at the Pánuco River near modern Tampico. There he made one final desperate attempt to found a settlement for Governor Garay. In 1520, his luck ran out entirely. He and most of his men were killed in a battle with the local Huastec people. When a supply ship arrived later, the crew found no colony. They found only the charred remains of his fleet. Spain possessed its chart, but Pineda had been erased from the shore he first mapped. Storm, steel, smallpox, Narváez's folly, Cortés's fortune. The erasure of Pineda left Spain with a crude map of the Gulf Coast, but the men vying to control its edges were busy tearing each other apart. Crafting an excuse for why a mountain of unauthorized treasure just arrived in Spain requires a specific kind of audacity. Hernán Cortés possessed it in abundance. While Pineda's challenge burned out on the Pánuco River, a far more personal storm gathered back in Cuba. Governor Diego Velázquez deeply regretted authorizing Cortés's original expedition. He learned his subordinate had bypassed him entirely. Cortés had sent Moctezuma's gold directly to King Charles V. Velázquez was cut out of the deal entirely. He found himself reduced from a venture capitalist to a forgotten footnote. His fury required an instrument, a man he could trust to sail to Mexico and reassert his authority with extreme prejudice. He found one in Pánfilo de Narváez, an old partner and relative who was promptly named Governor of Mexico, a title that at the time existed only on paper. Narváez's mission was simple: arrest Cortés and take over. To accomplish this, Velázquez funded a flotilla of 18 ships and nearly 1,400 men, a force roughly double what Cortés had. Narváez, brimming with the kind of confidence that often precedes a historic blunder, boasted he was certain to imprison Cortés so you can do with him as you please. Before this floating human resources dispute could leave port, the High Court in Santo Domingo dispatched a judge named Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón. The judge was sent to prevent a civil war between Spaniards on foreign soil. He warned Narvaez that proceeding carried a fine of 50,000 ducats. Narvaez ignored the legal order. He ordered his men to seize Ailon. Guards locked the judge on a ship. Narvaez then deported him. The law had been told to wait elsewhere. In late April 1520, Narvaez and his massive army landed at Veracruz. Cortés was preoccupied in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. He received the news. He quickly returned to the coast with fewer than 350 men. Facing an army that outnumbered his own by 4-1, he deployed bribery. He dispatched negotiators, including the priest Friar Bartolomé de Olmedo, into the opposing camp. Their pockets carried heavy gold chains and jewels. Cortés didn't see a hostile army. He saw 1,400 potential employees awaiting the right signing bonus. Narvaez's chief artilleryman accepted 1,000 pesos to stuff the main cannon with wax. Key captains took 20,000 castellanos to change their minds at the exact right moment. Cortés's gold rapidly compromised the camp. Meanwhile, Narvaez himself had taken over the Totonac city of Chempoalan, setting up his command post atop the main pyramid, a structure that served as a perfect citadel of complacency. Though his scouts reported Cortés's approach, he could not believe his smaller rival would dare attack such a superior force. He failed to prepare, basking in the certainty of his own victory. On a stormy night between May 27th and 29th, 1520, with rain lashing down, Cortés attacked. His men moved with a grim efficiency, quickly securing the cavalry and the recently sabotaged artillery. The fighting swirled to the summit of the pyramid, where, in the chaos, a pike found Narvaez. His cavernous voice bellowed over the storm, "Holy Mary, they are killing me and have shattered my eye." The soldier who delivered the blow, Pedro Sanchez Farfan, was later rewarded by Cortés for his excellent work. Narvaez, wounded and missing an eye, was captured. The consequences were immediate and transformative. The vast majority of Narvaez's men, tempted by the allure of Tenochtitlan's riches, defected to Cortés on the spot. By losing a battle, Cortés had won an army, securing the manpower he needed to conquer the Aztec Empire. But Narvaez's armada delivered one other passenger, an enslaved African man suffering from smallpox. The virus spread through the native population with an apocalyptic fury, acting as an unintentional biological weapon that would do more to secure the Spanish conquest than any battle. Narvaez himself was imprisoned for 2 years in Veracruz, where he spent his time brooding over every mistake he had made and every man who had betrayed him. Upon his release around 1524, Narvaez returned to Spain, scarred forever from his experience in Mexico. He launched a furious legal assault against Cortés before the Council of the Indies, demanding compensation for his lost eye, his captured fleet, and his wounded pride. He presented his case with the righteous anger of a man who had been cheated out of a sure thing. But the king, who had grown quite fond of the Aztec gold Cortés kept sending, found himself in an awkward position. In a gesture that was part settlement and part dismissal, the crown granted Narvaez a concession in 1526, a brand new charter to go and conquer a place called La Florida. Red beard, red hand, from conquest to crown. It seems that every great historical fiasco needs a leading man, and the name Pánfilo de Narvaez, fresh off a spectacular failure against Cortés in Mexico, was suddenly on the bill for La Florida. Before he became a cautionary tale with one fewer eye, Narvaez was an enterprise of pure physical presence. Born in Castile around 1470 or 1478 to the upper crust of Spanish society, he was a man built on a scale that suggested his architect had been over-caffeinated. Contemporaries described him as tall and somewhat blonde, inclined to redness, with a beard the color of a setting star. His most memorable feature, however, was a voice that apparently rumbled up from the planet's core, a resonant boom that witnesses claimed came as if it came from a cave. One imagines his marriage to Maria de Valenzuela involved a lot of shouting, "What?" across the breakfast table. This walking cathedral of a man didn't stay in Spain to admire himself in the mirror. He sailed for the New World, arriving in Jamaica in 1509 to participate in its conquest. 2 years later, his career found its footing when he joined his relative, the governor of Cuba Diego Velázquez, for that island's subjugation. There, commanding a company of 30 crossbowmen, Narváez honed his signature skill, being, as his reputation put it, brave against Indians. His methods of persuasion were not exactly an exercise in delicate diplomacy. He was rewarded handsomely with land and a title, Lieutenant Governor of Cuba, proving that results, however grimly achieved, were what mattered. His approach to colonial administration was, shall we say, direct. Bartolomé de las Casas, a chaplain who escorted him on an expedition to Camagüey, left behind accounts of massacres and local chiefs being casually burned alive. Yet this same man, a connoisseur of organized brutality, was also a shrewd politician. He traveled back to the Spanish court between 1516 and 1518 to lobby on behalf of European settlers in Cuba, his efforts supercharged by the first whispers of gold trickling out of Yucatan. He must have been convincing because in November 1518, King Charles not only confirmed his relative Velázquez's authority but also appointed Narváez himself as comptroller. Destiny found the ambitious conquistador ready for a cosmic joke. The crown handed him an accountant's job just before Cortés launched his mutiny, wrecked the armada, and permanently maimed him in the stormy dark of Mexico. Now, nursing a bruised ego and holding a fresh deed to a coastline he had never seen, Narváez prepared to sail toward a peninsula that had already developed a brutal reputation for breaking Spanish ambition. Arrows to ashes, Florida's abortive genesis. Before Pánfilo de Narváez could fail on the Gulf Coast, someone else had to clear the way and establish the peninsula's miserable reputation. From the grand courts where Narváez so recently strutted, we must look backward a few years to a time when Florida was still an unchecked box on the imperial map rather than a graveyard for the ambitious. It was a golden age of bureaucracy, an era when a well-connected gentleman, finding himself vexed by the petty squabbles of island governance, might simply petition his king for a license to ruin a completely new piece of geography. That pioneer was Juan Ponce de León. Modern tourist traps brand him as a dreamer chasing a magical fountain of youth, but he was actually just a stressed-out middle manager looking for a lateral transfer. By 1521, 8 years after he first bumped into the peninsula, Ponce was locked in a tedious human resources dispute with Diego Colón, the son of Christopher Columbus. Diego controlled the established Caribbean territories and was a micromanager of the highest order. Ponce sought a jurisdiction where he would not have to report to a colon. He leveraged a royal contract signed by King Ferdinand back in 1512, which granted him the rights to the island of Bimini and anything else he happened to find. Holding the title of adelantado, a military governor of a place he had not yet conquered, Ponce launched his grand colonization project. This was a heavily capitalized imperial effort. He departed Cuba in 1521 with 2 ships and a veritable Noah's Ark of occupation, packing 200 souls. The roster included soldiers to clear the land, priests to bless the clearing, and farmers to plant crops over whatever remained. He brought 50 horses and a menagerie of pigs and cattle. He fully intended to turn the wild swamps of southwest Florida into a functioning Spanish agricultural hub, attempting to transplant a delicate Castilian garden into a fortress already occupied by people who despised him. The ships likely dropped anchor near present-day Charlotte Harbor or the Caloosahatchee River. Today, this stretch of coast is known for retirement communities and shelling beaches. But in 1521, it was the absolute stronghold of the Calusa. They were a powerful, centralized network of communities that engineered entire islands out of shells and controlled the coast with an iron grip. They also had long memories. Ponce had snatched Calusa people during his 1513 voyage, and other Spanish freelancers like the slaving pilot Diego Miruelo had spent the intervening years raiding their beaches. When Ponce's flotilla appeared on the horizon, the Calusa did not see brave explorers. They saw a returning infection. The colony collapsed before the settlers could properly roast their first pig. Resistance was immediate and organized. The Spanish barely had time to unload their farming tools before the arrows began to fly. In the ensuing skirmish, the adelantado took a strike to the thigh. The single arrow was likely tipped with the sap of the manchineel tree, a plant so toxic that standing under its leaves during a rainstorm causes violent skin blisters. Injecting that sap directly into the bloodstream was an agonizing death sentence. Carried back to the ship, bleeding and feverish, Ponce de Leon must have looked at the chaotic shoreline. His retreating boats and screaming livestock remained behind against an impenetrable wall of mangroves. He held the king's paper, the grand title, the pigs, and the priests. On the edge of the known world, however, European bureaucracy proved roughly as useful as a wax seal in a tidal wave. He was just a trespasser with a very expensive permit. The survivors abandoned the project immediately and steered their battered ships toward Havana, Cuba. There, in July 1521, Juan Ponce de Leon died of his infected wound. The significance of this disaster deeply rattled the Spanish court. It was their first formal attempt to plant a permanent settlement in the continental United States, and it washed out completely. The irony was bitterly timed. At that exact moment, Hernán Cortés was busy dismantling the Aztec Empire and seizing Tenochtitlan in Mexico. Cortés found gold and glory, while Ponce found a poisoned stick and a shallow grave. The contrast sent a clear warning that Mexico was an imperial prize, but Florida was a resistant, costly frontier uniquely suited to chew up explorers. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 2, Shadow Charts and Florida Fantasies. The through line here is that vague, unrecorded knowledge doesn't just fade quietly, it gets recycled as false confidence, and Diego Miruelo's murky bay visit would soon send several hundred people marching into a peninsula that had no interest in being found. Next chapter, Narvaez finally gets his royal charter, Cabeza de Vaca gets a job title he'll regret, and the whole enterprise begins its long, waterlogged unraveling in Chapter 3. If this journey has you wanting more, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors and Condos. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon. Until next time, this has been The Rise the Limit.